Welcome back, y'all. Appreciate you joining me in today's video. And today I'm gonna be chatting a little bit about my experience using Downtube shifters in a group ride, which it was my very first time doing an actual road bike group ride. I wanted to report how the threadless stem conversion has been treating me, and also a few parts I wound up having to swap before the big trip. So the big ride that I was referencing was hosted by none other than Lewis Scott, aka The Good Wheel, a cycling channel that I've been watching for such a long time. He was hosting his Cafecito con Lou. It was the fourth iteration of the ride, and I knew I had to make it. So it involved a road trip, so putting all that time and effort into making it, I had to make sure my bike was ready to go. So before the trip, I had to make sure everything was mechanically sound and ready to go. And just coming from the threadless stem conversion video, that was already adjusted perfectly. Didn't have to worry about that. But the first thing that popped up was the Michelin Dynamic Sport rear tire actually had a blowout while I was on the rollers. It was crazy because I was feeling this bump on the tire and it got progressively worse. And then that infamous gunshot sound happened and totally blew out the tire. So I did have a replacement, the Bontrager R3s that I've had on my fixed gear. Slapped that on here, and surprisingly the 32C did fit. I mean, it is such a squeeze, but it happened to work, so I'm very thankful for that. But that wasn't a big deal. The next thing that wound up happening a few days later, and on the rollers again, was I was shifting from my big ring down to my smallest chain ring, and for some reason the chain snagged the front derailleur and totally bent the cage. And honestly, the Suntour GPX front derailleur is pretty much toast, and that's why I went back to the Shimano Tiagra front derailleur as a temporary fix. But this front derailleur is so good that I think I'm just going to stick with it on this build. So next step was road tripping down to Fort Lauderdale, which is about 3 hours from where I live. Not too bad on Highway 27, and it was taking place on a Sunday morning, so there really wasn't a lot of traffic either. So we did set out and we took off, and I knew that since it was my first time being around that many people riding, I didn't want to film too much and get a little too careless. So only the parts where I knew it was a straightaway and I could see really far ahead is when I whipped out the camera and took a few shots that I'll insert here and there in this video. But first things first is I'm kind of surprised. Again, I haven't been on a group ride before like that, but I'm kind of surprised how fast you actually go with how little effort you put in. And also, what I wound up noticing was I was on my big chain ring, and in the group ride, I was on my highest gear. And whenever I'm riding solo, I never get to that high of gear, but it was seriously easy. But I forgot to mention the pace was kind of around the 22 mile an hour mark. So it wasn't super easy, but it wasn't ridiculous. That I still have to do with this bike and Downtube shifters, but it was a pretty decent pace. Another thing that I wanted to make sure I experienced was riding in the back and then riding in the front. And of course, riding in the back, you get a little slinky effect. You have to accelerate and brake a little more frequently than if you ride in the front. It's a little more smoother, but that was no problem on this bike at all. It was exactly what I expected, but I think the biggest thing was since I was on Downtube shifters and everyone starts to accelerate, I can't shift while I'm accelerating, so I had to make sure I was on a little bit of a higher gear than normal if I was with STI shifters, and that strategy actually worked. I got up to speed no problem, just a little bit of extra effort, but no big deal. Especially if you train like that, it's gonna be a non-issue. But of course, another factor is It's completely flat out there, so there's no hills, but the challenge was accelerating a little bit. So I do feel like if you're not used to Downtube shifters, I would not recommend doing a group ride. But since I've been riding them for years, they're second nature and it was really enjoyable. I didn't have a big issue except for just making sure I was coordinated and going with the flow with the group and not causing any issues, which thankfully nothing happened. I was a little nervous about that. Yeah, after about a 20-minute ride, we wound up at a coffee shop, stopped there a little bit. Luckily, there's a bathroom. And that's when people started noticing my bike. I love how quiet and rural it is right now here. However, you come across certain situations where if I go any further, there's a bunch of dogs that will chase me. So I can't go that way. It's a dirt road to the left. I don't have my gravel bike, so got to turn around now on this road bike. And honestly, I was kind of surprised and impressed with how much everyone appreciated the bike. And it kind of took me off guard. You know, down in South Florida, there's a lot of expensive bikes. There's a lot of new, like around $20,000 type bikes, but everyone was like stoked to see this steel bike and how good of a condition it was, because of course there's a lot of new old stock and really lightly used parts, and the support was fantastic. So if I spoke with anyone down there and we were chatting about the bike, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. But again, I was so happy to see that this bike was bringing such joy to so many people, and I loved seeing that. I wanted to stop real quick to get the outro clip, but one thing I wanted to mention about the Suntour Cyclone brake hoods is whenever I was accelerating, they kind of feel a little bit narrow compared to the Shimano SLR aero brake levers. So that's something to note, and maybe I'll do a more in-depth review in a future video, but it does feel pretty thin and the grip is honestly not the best, especially when accelerating from the hoods. Because that's what I was doing most of the time, was being a little more upright, less aggressive, because I wanted to really pay attention to what everyone was doing. But after the coffee shop, we actually went straight back to the park where we originally met, because the wind was picking up like crazy. And that's the thing in Florida right now. Every day has been so ridiculously windy. It's like the cold front's trying to make it down here, but it just keeps losing the battle. And it's only like 73, 74 degrees right now in mid-November. Once again, I gotta thank Lewis for putting on that event. It was such a pleasure meeting you, and can't wait to go back down there again. And if everyone was interested in that ride, follow Lewis Scott. I think on Instagram, it's The Good Wheel or The Good Cyclist. And then usually I think they're twice a year. So if you're in the South Florida and he announces one, highly recommend it. But in conclusion, I really enjoyed the ride. Using Downtube shifters in a modern group ride was fantastic, made it extra fun. But the next group ride that I plan to do is gonna be a little bit more gas, so I'll see how this bike performs, especially with the Downtube shifters and trying to keep up. But my question to you all is, have you ever done a quicker pace group ride with Downtube shifters? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to read all about it. But since the sun is setting, I got to get home. So I'm going to wrap up this video here. If you've been following me on Instagram or even my community posts here, you'll notice that I was able to attain another nice condition Diamondback override from the early 90s, and that's going to be my next project, so stay tuned for that. I'm going to be posting a lot of updates and maybe even a build / maintenance video for it. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.